In terms of all of the minor factions of Middle-earth, the ones that you don't hear too much about in Tolkien's writings, I've always found Rhudaur to be one of the more interesting ones, purely because of the fact that once upon a time they were of course a part of the Kingdom of Old Arnor, and in more recent times they are known as the Traitor Kingdom. Of all of the forces of men in Middle-earth, many of which of course are famed for their weaknesses, Rhudaur falling completely into the darkness is maybe one of the more standout examples of this. Having said that, Rhudaur's somewhat duality in terms of their nature make them interesting, and also the fact that even a kingdom such as this and a force that would resemble far more tribal forces, and the Northmen of course, do have links to the Númenóreans and are a Númenórean inheritor kingdom in their own right, albeit the blood of Númenor probably runs thinnest in Rhudaur of any that can boast such a thing. So there is that to consider. But as we go through their roster a little bit later on in the video, we will see some mentions of the Númenóreans, and in particular the Hranadyne class of units still bear a linguistic link as well to their brother kingdoms of Arnor and the Dunedain. But for now, we'll talk about Rhudaur's military force in more sweeping terms and go through some of their strengths and weaknesses. And going through their strengths first and foremost, they do bear most in common with some of the tribal forces, in particular the nation of Harad, which are geographically furthest away from them really of any of the forces of Middle-earth. However, throwing projectiles are the main thing that you would note as Rhudaur, and before the slingers were added, they had an example of every type of throwing projectile unit that the game has to offer, both mounted and dismounted. However, the advent of the slingers has changed that a little bit, so that is a small gap in their throwing projectile lineup, but I think they are still the most well-rounded of all of the throwing projectile forces in the game, and this comes from the fact that they have very good throwing axes and more than one example of such, as well as having a good lineup of javelins as well, a mounted throwing projectile unit to aid in the hunting down of enemy cavalry as well. It gives them a really well-rounded force in this regard, as well as having very high damage. You would say the Demons of the Desert of Harad still, as a singular throwing projectile unit, have the highest damage potential, and the Meduseld Guard may be probably the most well-balanced throwing projectile unit that the game has to offer, but Rhudaur still have an equivalent of this type, and we will get onto that when we go and talk about their roster. But as far as breadth of units goes, I really do think that Rhudaur have the best selection, and considering the damage that throwing projectiles are able to do, and when it comes to defending, Rhudaur are a little bit more reliant on this sort of thing for reasons which we'll talk about a bit later. But yeah, throwing projectiles definitely a real feather in the cap of this faction. And moving on as well, something which is somewhat linked to this, but not completely, is the fact that Rhudaur also have access to very good armour piercing within their faction as well. Javelins, of course, being one example of this, but also in melee, all of Rhudaur's most dangerous units come with armour piercing front and centre. Many of them being two-handed axemen, berserker class units, bodyguard units as well. Even lower tier axemen as well really do pad out the armour piercing nature of all of Rhudaur's units, and it is a real bonus, especially when you consider that all of the factions west of the Misty Mountains, apart from Lindon, all pack on the armour as being a central part of their identity, including their overlords of Angmar. So if they did wish to rebel, this is one of the main ways in which they could do that. And also, of course, their previous brother kingdoms in Arnor are also armoured factions first and foremost. So Rhudaur, if they wish to continue their descent, they can also do that, invading their former brothers. But the final thing that we will mention in terms of the strengths for Rhudaur here is something which is certainly not alien to all of the evil men factions that the game has to offer, and that is the fact they are based around high numbers. Now, they do have access to some higher quality units, but even here, Rhudaur are maybe a little bit more numbers centric than many other forces that the game has to offer. But the centre around which their army is built, you know, basic swordsmen, basic spearmen, which is true of many of the human factions, whether good or evil, the numbers are really going to be the thing that sells this. And when you combine that with the damage that Rhudaur are able to do, both at mid to close range and in melee, they can be quite an intimidating faction, because that initial damage that they can do can then be backed up by overwhelming numbers, and you can find yourself in a bit of a hole that you can't dig yourself out of that easily. So yeah, high numbers, but again, this is pretty familiar to most of the evil men forces of Middle-earth. Having said that, Rhudaur also have their downsides, and once again, They bear more in common with the evil men than their fellow Númenórean inheritors, so this is perhaps a sign of how thin the blood has run and how distant that lineage now seems to them. And we are going to split one of the main weaknesses because they affect Rhudaur, it affects Rhudaur, I should say, in a rather different way. The first thing is going to be poor melee defense. Now this comes hand in hand with them being a very armor-piercing centric faction, because usually that means that they're going to have either Warhammer or Great Axe units as their central damage dealers up close, which comes with its obvious advantages, but also, more often than not, and certainly in the case of Rhudaur, it comes with this disadvantage as well. Poor melee defense means against forces that are able to withstand that onslaught and have a little bit more finesse about them. The elves come immediately to mind, but also the Dunedain of Arthedain and Cardlan are particularly strong in this regard as well. If Rhudaur's initial onslaught does not work, their poor melee defense means that their units can start to fall away a little bit more quickly, and that can be a problem, and it can cut into your numbers advantage pretty fast as well, and that is worth bearing in mind as you do get involved in these longer engagements, in particular when you get involved in siege battles where you have to try and force your way through narrower engagements. The poor melee defense, if it does come down to a straight up melee slog, can work against Rhudaur if they're not able to maximise their armour piercing advantages. They can get around this as well by backing themselves up with their good throwing projectile units, but realistically, if you do get isolated in a melee engagement, this can be a real concern for you. And linked to that, their overall defence is a bit of a problem, but the poor armour affects them in a bit of a different way, I would suggest, because it does mean that their ability to skirmish at long range is somewhat compromised. They can still do it slightly better than quite a few other evil forces, in particular their overlords of Angmar and the other Orcish factions. They can do it, but they're not quite so well set up for it as their former brothers in the rest of Arnor, because again, this armour value is one of the main things which can give you a real leg up in this kind of engagement. And also it means that enemy archers of all kinds can also do a lot of heavy damage to your mainline infantry units as well. You do have access to quite a few shielded units, and a few of your units as well come with some basic armour upgrades, but the baseline armour values are still so low that this does bear repeating. And if you do get bottled up in an engagement, it's not only your melee defense which could prove to be a real problem, but also this armour, when it comes to really peeling away at your numbers at long range, can also really be damaging to you. And it is another sign of Rhudaur being a faction which needs to do its damage relatively quickly, otherwise both of these two things can cause you to come unstuck. And the final thing to mention in a somewhat linked vein to this is I would consider Rhudaur a faction that are not particularly adaptable. And a lot of this is down to the fact that they are quite aggressive. They do need to do their damage up close and or up front and personal. And this is true of whether you're on the defence in a siege, the attack in a siege, or on the open field. You need to establish yourself reasonably quickly in order for your units to be effective in any given engagement. Now, they are still capable of laying on a more traditional front, if you will, with high numbers infantry backed up by some decent pikes, which we'll go on to in just a moment, but I would suggest that Rhudaur are mostly at their best when it comes to utilising those throwing projectiles, being very aggressive and doing the damage, and it makes them a very good foil actually to Angmar. In terms of a tag team, they're probably one of the most effective that Middle-earth has to offer, and it goes to show why perhaps the Witch King was such a menace for so long. But yeah, Rhudaur are very much a focused kind of faction, but it does mean that if you're forced out of your comfort zone, kept at arm's length a little bit more, you know, the battle gets a little bit more broken up, you're not able to utilise that heavy stopping power that you do have as Rhudaur, then there's not really too much of a plan B that you can engage in. You have to try and force the enemy really to play the kind of battle that you want to be involved in, and that can be a little bit of a problem if you're not able to do that. So low adaptability is one of the things that I've said here. But I think this will all become a little bit more clear as we transition over to the grassy plains and have a look at Rhudaur's units up close and personal. So we're back in the realms once again of being able to fit the entire roster onto a single field, and Rhudaur actually do have a fairly concise roster, and a decent portion of that is the two trash tier units, in quotation marks, have actually been removed from the faction overall. Not that they really needed those to be a numbers-focused faction anyway, so it's not a great loss to them, and it maybe does point to the fact that Rhudaur are maybe made of a little bit sterner stuff than some of the slightly lower quality evil men factions, like Dunland, for example, who do traffic in such units. But it is also interesting seeing the distribution of units. Obviously, you don't expect Rhudaur to have a huge amount of cavalry, and they don't, but they have plenty of skirmishers, as we already alluded to in the strengths and weaknesses. It is weighted certainly towards throwing weaponry, but we'll get onto that in just a moment. Another important part of Rhudaur's makeup is going to be their infantry force, and we shall start off with the Rhudaur swordsmen, which are a reasonably cheap at 450 and reasonably numerous at 228 under usual circumstances unit of line infantry, and they are strong and weak in all the ways you would expect, although an attack of 8 is actually maybe punching above what you would expect for this kind of unit, especially at this kind of cost and numbers. They actually can manage to, at least in terms of the purely attacking numbers, manage to outdamage some of the other Western kingdoms. Now, they only have a numbers advantage of around 20 or so, but even so, when you consider that they have a greater attack score as well compared to something like, for example, the Cardinal men-at-arms that we saw last time, that can be useful against certain opposition. However, line infantry units like this, and I've said it before and I'll say it again, but the defensive values are paramount in this kind of unit being effective. And this is where the Rhudaur swordsmen do fall down a little bit, because of course you don't expect them to, but they don't have the best of defensive skill, nor do they have the best armour, and you can't upgrade their armour either, so this is your lot. The shield value honestly isn't too bad, and considering the cost and the upsides to them, I really do rate the Rhudaur swordsmen as a pretty dependable frontline unit, but do bear in mind that they are not going to be as rigid and as stalwart, especially against projectile-based units, as many of their Western counterparts. But still, you know, they do have their upsides, and that is always a bonus when you're talking about a unit which ultimately you get sent onto the front line as what is the thing that most closely resembles cannon fodder for a faction like Rhudaur. So again, it just goes to show that maybe they do have something a little bit more about them than some of their fellow evil men. And then you have their basic spears as well, and also, contrary to some of the other Western kingdoms, they don't take a numbers penalty with this unit either, so they have the same amount of men in this unit as the standard swordsman, which means you're not losing anything in terms of numbers if you do decide to bring the Rhudaur clansmen, for the same cost as well. So it really is purely a case of whether you think you need some spears with a slightly better shield value, obviously lower attack, but better defensively in some ways, or whether you want the enhanced damage that the Rhudaur swordsman can offer, although the Rhudaur clansmen are one of 2 units that do actually have an armour upgrade available to them, and it does make a visual difference as well. It still only upgrades their armour to 3, to be fair, which is still not fantastic, but every little helps, and it does just make you that little bit more resilient against skirmishers from the front as well when you twin that with their big shield value of 9, but they do not count as great shield infantry, so you won't have access to the increased mass that such a unit affords you. And again, these spears will have the same downsides that any spear has in terms of the spear malice, but the attack of 6, even here, is still not half bad. Rhudaur do have good attack across their army as a whole, but again, armour of 3 at best and a defensive skill of 1 means that they are pretty vulnerable to the right kinds of units in melee, especially shock infantry. Heavy swordsmen in particular are going to run through the Rhudaur clansmen very, very easily, you would suggest. But still, bonus fighting cavalry as well, so a good flanking unit, a good defensive unit from the front because of their big shields and the spear as a weapon. So much like the Rhudaur swordsmen, they do have some pretty distinct downsides, but the upsides are also very well pronounced. And a unit which by its very nature across any faction would also have the same distinction as the other entry-level unit the Rhudaur have, which is the Rhudaur Axeman. And as you would expect, you have an armour-piercing, a relatively cheap armour-piercing unit, slightly more expensive than the other 2 at 500, but that's because you do have an attack of 11, charge of 12, which in much the same way as some of the other more numerous Orcish Axemen, is slightly lower than some entry-level units of a similar type from the other kingdoms of men, the Rhudaur Axemen in particular. These guys don't have heightened numbers either, so that is maybe a bit of a concern. But if you do want a bit of armour-piercing bite for not a huge outlay on your front line, then this is going to be the unit that you need to use. And as you would expect of an entry-level heavy Axemen unit, no shield value, defensive skill of 3, which is very low, armour of 3, which is very low. They're going to get ripped apart by arrow fire, they're going to get easily dealt with by higher tier infantry, especially those that are not overly dependent on armour, especially if they're isolated as well. If you're going to use this unit, you need to make sure to get the charge bonus off, which is easier said than done, or use them in a combined arms situation, which is a little bit easier to achieve with Rhudaur, because you do have a varied option list when it comes to your infantry, as we've already seen a bit of and will continue to see. But yeah, a blunt instrument, as always, this kind of unit, effective against armour. The one thing that you would say about them is that they can't be targeted down by archers unless you move them first, because they can hide anywhere, which is a nice thing, because obviously arrow fire is going to be one of the main things that you want to avoid when utilising this unit, because it will rip through them very, very quickly. Now then, onto the units with a little bit more about them. You're going to have to spend a little bit more on these, but they will give you a little something extra. And when it comes to holding down a front line, this is going to be the option for you as Rhudaur. The Rhudaur pikemen, all of the Arnorian factions have got access to a unit of pikes, which is very good, well, not of good quality, shall we say. A unit which is going to be sitting in the centre of your line, really holding everything down, and also inspiring all the units around you. Now, Rhudaur, I didn't list it as a weakness because it's not. They don't actually have bad morale, especially when you compare them to the other evil men factions. Again, it just, again, another one of those little things which sort of denotes them as being maybe a little bit above them. Obviously, the Rhudaur linked to the Dunedain, you would imagine. But yes, and also another very distinct feature of these guys is the fact they have a shield from the front. Not a huge shield value of 6, but it is still significant enough to pose a problem. I think they were, way back when, the first unit of this type, the first pike unit to have a front-facing shield. So they were the progenitor, really, of many a unit that has come after them. And it is useful for Rhudaur, because, of course, without that, they would still be very vulnerable to missiles. Their armour score is not particularly high, but, again, as I've said before, it's kind of difficult to gauge pikes next to other units when you look at them based on pure stats numbers. But yeah, the inspiration of nearby troops is still useful, because ultimately, while Rhudaur's morale isn't terrible, neither is it particularly outstanding. So having a unit like this inspire your swordsmen and spearmen to stand in place is still going to be useful, as well as the ability to hold many a unit at arm's length. The phalanx formation being the key to that, of course. Bonus fighting cavalry. Other than that, they are just a unit of pikes that perform pretty damn well. And as is the case with many a Rhudaur unit as well, the attack of 9 is pretty decent for a pike unit. Pikes are never really going to be a unit that deals damage too quickly outside of the very best of them. But Rhudaur will at least do damage at a faster rate than most. Albeit, again, compared to the equivalent Cardlan, as we've already seen, and we will see soon, the Arthurdanian variant, they are a little bit more defensively compromised, shall we say. Another unit of heavy axemen that can hide anywhere as a useful trait are the Blackwalds, and these are the Rhudaur berserkers, and when you compare them to other berserkers, well, namely the Uruk-hai that we saw a couple of weeks ago, they are a little bit less durable, but they are also a little bit cheaper. The ability to hide anywhere is nice as well. It plays into the fact that Rhudaur, if the opportunity arises, you can play as a bit of an ambush-style faction, a bit of guerrilla warfare and hit and run, and the Blackwalds are going to be your heaviest hitting unit of melee infantry that are able to do that. Their axes always look like they were almost made out of granite based on the textures that are on them, which is kind of an interesting concept. Obviously effective against armour, they also cause fear against units that they're fighting against, so if the fight is going against your opposition, then this is the kind of unit which can really hasten the demise mentally of your opposition. An attack of 18 is obviously massive, as well as the charge bonus of 14. Defensive stats are obviously extremely low outside of that second hit point, and they have no shield. Defensive skill is also pretty low in comparison to some other berserkers like the ones from Rovanian and from Isengard, and the armour is also next to non-existent, so they're pretty much the most blunt example of this kind of unit that the game has to offer. They also have this slightly strange formation in the sense that they're in scattered, which against missiles, once they're revealed, actually does put them a little bit further apart, but it also makes them quite unwieldy when you're utilising them in tight spaces, and especially when you're in a siege or in buildings in the deployment phase, it can make them a real pain to actually position, but that's by the by really. As soon as you do get them there, they are still a very effective part of the Rhudaur roster. And when it comes to straight up infantry, we have the Witch Realm Enslavers, a unit of armour-piercing, two-handed units. I mean, tridents are something they have a bit of a monopoly on in the game, and if you do want just a straight-up infantry unit as your bodyguard, then this is the only option you have as Rhudaur, and it is, perhaps fittingly, quite similar to what you will see when we get on to talking about Angmar at a later date. They have a very similar unit to this, albeit as you would expect of Rhudaur, they put a slightly lower emphasis on the defensive stats. They are all about that offense. They inspire the troops around them as well, so a little bit more aggressive perhaps than the Rhudaur pikemen, but if they are at the centre of your efforts, they will be making sure that your fellow Rhudaur forces are going to be facing the right direction still. Of course, they cause fear as well. When you look at them, that's pretty much their MO. Effective against armour as well with those two-handers. Big stats as well. 20 attack, charge bonus of 15 as you would expect. 73 is maybe slightly lower on the man count than some equivalent units. Shield value 0. 2 hit points rather than 3, but that's to be expected for this kind of unit as well. It fits very much in with the kind of things that Rhudaur prioritise. But the total defense of 25 is pretty good, especially when you consider the armour on these guys is good. I mean, Rhudaur are not completely without heavily armoured units. It's just that you have to get up into the bleeding edge of their quality before you really start to see those values skyrocket a bit. And the defensive skill of 14, which is not half bad for an armour-piercing shock troop like this. Still a blunt instrument though, even though they're at the high end of their game. Now then, Skirmishers, which are perhaps the most significant part of the Rhudaur roster, and we start off with a very cost-effective unit indeed across most situations. The Trollshaw Axe Throwers, one of 2 units of throwing axes that Rhudaur have, this one being the more basic variant. The stats in melee are pretty poor, not the worst that you'll ever see. The melee attack is actually not too bad, and I guess that's because they save one of their axes so that they can utilise it up close, so they can actually dish out a surprising amount of damage to the right kinds of units, fellow low-tier units mainly, but of course their defensive stats are pretty bad. Armour very low, defensive skill very low, no shield. They can hide anywhere, which is good, because one of the main things you'll be wanting to avoid with these guys is trying to get involved in a slinging match with enemy archers, because that's one way that you can take a lot of damage with them very quickly, but 500 is not a huge amount to spend. And throwing axes, as we've seen in the past, their base damage is very high. Admittedly, 12 is on the lower end of things, but when you consider you're only spending 500 on them, it starts to make a lot more sense. Bonus fighting cavalry can hide anywhere. Lots of good little things here, and that's why it's such an efficient unit and why you'll see them pretty much every time you see Rhudaur take to the field. They do have options when it comes to slightly long range. They used to have a trash tier archer as well, but that has gone because really the Rhudaur marksman and they always shared the same kind of role anyway. So the basic archer, in much the same way as way back when we were talking about Dunland, getting involved in a skirmishing fight with this kind of faction is not recommended. Rhudaur do much better when you're at close range with their throwing projectiles and bringing their melee savagery to bear. If you're getting held back and you're getting involved in a long-range slinging match, it's not great for you. But if you do, this is the unit that you can at least use to contest that. They can use stakes. They're pretty good actually at avoiding cavalry bearing down on them, because they do have those stakes. And also, as you can see on their backs, they do have a spear as their melee weapon. So as much as cavalry can still do lots of damage to them off the charge, if they linger too long, the Rhudaur marksman can pack a surprising punch there as well. Defensive skill not too bad, but of course enemy archers are the main concern. You're never going to be winning archer duels as Rhudaur, which is why you want to close the distance, which is very similar to many a faction that we've seen in the past already on the evil side of things for Middle-earth, so Rhudaur falling in step with their fellows there. But also slightly better perhaps all round than some of the other factions that maybe don't prioritise archers quite so much. We've seen obviously Dunland already, Isengard quite similar, Harad as well, quite similar at the base level at the very least. So Rhudaur have, again, just a little bit more about them in terms of the quality. Decent numbers as well. But when it comes to dealing damage at long range, much in the same way as many factions that have access to rangers, the best way to do that is going to be through these guys, the Rhanodine Rangers, the Rhudaur equivalent to the Dunedain Rangers. And as you would expect, they are pretty similar with all the same weaknesses, as is the case with many a ranger. They have very low armour, but that also means that they fall in step with pretty much everything in the Rhudaur roster anyway. The defensive skill is reasonably high, but there are rangers with higher defensive skills than this, so the Rhanodine among rangers maybe do lag behind a little bit in some cases, but again, that makes a certain amount of sense. But the missile attack is still 8. The melee attack is actually pretty decent as well. That is one way that Rhudaur do differentiate themselves. I think they may be the only ranger in the game, and we will see this at a later date when we look at them in more detail next to one another directly. But they may be the only ranger in the game to have a higher melee attack than melee defense. So that's interesting. But as you would expect, long range, high damage, keep them safe, they can hide anywhere, so that makes that a little bit easier. Hit the right kind of units, go after quite high priority targets with them, and they will pay you back in spades. And if you are in a siege as well, attack or defense, the same principle applies, but just the potential reward is just that little bit higher. There's not very many of them though, 120, so they can be targeted down easily, so it is on you to look after them. And now, for a javelin unit, slightly higher tier than the troll shores just in front of them, we have the Ettenmoor's troll hunters. They stand out a little bit in the sense that they do have better armour than many of their fellows in Rhudaur, up at an armour score of 8, which puts them more into line with what many of the other Western Kingdoms do have, but again, to have to spend 850 gold on a unit before you start getting equivalent armour scores to some of the basic units from other factions like Cardlin is maybe a sign of, again, one of Rhudaur's most distinct weaknesses. Spears in melee, much the same way as the Trollshore axe throwers, sort of save one of their axes to use in melee to give them a better attack score. The Ettenmoor's troll hunters utilise one of their pointy sticks as a cudgel, I should say, against enemy cavalry units. Good missile attack at 10 and total defense score as well. Pretty good all round, to be fair, because they do have a good shield value. Defensive skill is reasonably low, but they are actually a pretty good all rounder. If it comes down to the late game and you're still looking to maybe outlast your opponent, then the Ettenmoor's troll hunters are going to be one of the better choices of units that you can utilise for that purpose. As Rhudaur, obviously again, bonus fighting cavalry is nice, and the armour piercing missiles always going to be important. Again, armoured factions really don't like fighting off against Rhudaur because there's not many of their units, honestly, which can't deal with such a thing in an efficient manner if you let them. So yeah, not many men in the unit again, but these are more expensive. So again, look after them, but they are at least a little bit more durable than the rangers that they stand next to. And then they don't have any out-and-out bodyguard units at this tier, but they do have some high-end skirmishers as well. One javelin, one throwing axe. The Reforged javelins over here are the highest tier of javelin units that Rhudaur have. I mean, again, 123, and considering they have a second hit point, that is a pretty good value proposition, especially seeing as they can hide anywhere. So you could put your general in here if you wanted, but again, it's right on the borderline because many of the other stats are not really at bodyguard level. It's kind of the inverse of something like the Elder Renway Swordsman, where all of their stats are fantastic, they just lack that second hit point. For Rodram Javelins, it's kind of the other way around. They still have good attacking scores in melee, but 12 and 10 is not really too much different to the sort of thing that you would expect to see from the Rhudaur Axeman at the entry level. But, and again, armour of 2. Defensive skill is at least a lot better, those armour-piercing war clubs in melee, but one of the things that sets them apart as well, of course, is the fact they have those javelins as well. They're just a little bit more multifaceted when it comes to being an aggressive unit in comparison to the Ettenmoor's troll hunters. It's just a case of what you're after. But yeah, I mean, they are more vulnerable, so you do have to look after them, but the damage proposition for high-end, high-damage skirmishers like this is always good, but it is their vulnerabilities which probably put them below both the Demons of the Desert and the Medicel Guard when it comes to the best units of javelins that the game has to offer. But still, fantastic unit at dealing damage, but I think probably in terms of the very greatest of the skirmishers, or the throwing skirmishers that Rhudaur have, it probably would be these guys, the Hranadine Berserkers, throwing axes and also very effective troops in melee as well. Big damage, I mean they are one-handed axe and shield infantry, so it's actually one of the instances where the unit is not armour-piercing up close, and nor is it armour-piercing from far away either. They're all about that base damage, which is, again, I think fairly unique among the rest of the Rhudaur roster that we've seen so far, but still they are all about their offensive capabilities more than anything else, because their armour is still very low. They do have a shield, which does help them, and a second hit point once again, another unit that costs 1,000 gold as well, so they do have defensive attributes that they can bring to bear. And also, when you consider the big melee attack and big missile attack, they've got plenty of attributes that you can utilise. You just need to be aware of the fact that in spite of their high cost and in spite of their role within the army, they do still have some instances of stats that are much lower than you would like them to be at this level. But that is the trade-off with Rhudaur. You have some very clearly defined strengths as well as a couple of pitfalls that you can fall into if you're not careful, but again, very savage at close range. Whether they get caught before they use all of their ammunition or not, they're always going to be able to do a good job for you in that regard, you would say. Now, Rhudaur have a relatively small cavalry force, but it's still one which is going to be able to at least be a pain for your opposition to have to deal with. and that starts with the Coldfell Maidens, which are essentially your cavalry hunters. Naturally, Javelin cavalry always kind of falls into this role, and the Coldfells are no different. See, the Javelins, armour piercing, missile attack of 8 is slightly lower than their footbound Javelins in the Ettenmoor's Troll Hunters and the Ferodrum Javelins, but they do have that mobility. Not the most numerous unit, and also, as has been seen several times in the past, in spite of the shield and in spite of the chainmail, which does afford them more protection than some of the units in the Rhudaur roster, in all fairness, they are still pretty vulnerable to getting zoned out by archers and horse archers and the like. So when you commit them, you have to be sure that they're going to be able to get the job done, because if they don't and you have to make them retreat, you can find your unit getting cut down by a good amount by the time you do. So again, that lower Rhudaur defensive score can be their nemesis, but they also have a bonus fighting cavalry up close. Admittedly, their stats aren't amazing, so you do want to use their javelins first before then moving in for the kill to finish them off, and you will need perhaps their bodyguard tier cavalry to give them a hand, but they can be a part of a greater whole when it comes to your cavalry force. And again, I think Rhudaur, they're never going to be a cavalry powerhouse, but they can make life very difficult for just about anyone as long as the composition and support around them are correct, and the Coldfell Maidens are one of the main parts of that. And also, they do have access to a unit of very high-end cavalry indeed, the Rhudaur Nobles, which are a unit of knights. Ultimately, they have a bonus fighting cavalry. Not only that, but they wield armour-piercing morning stars in melee. So again, in typical Rhudaur fashion, they trade in a bit of defence, because many of these kind of units have got a higher total defence score than 26, and even though they are the other unit which you can upgrade the armour of and give them just a little bit more rigidity, an armour score of 11, defensive skill of 10, shield of 6, this is still lagging behind a few others, but it is those armour-piercing attacks in melee which do set them apart, and depending on the exact manner of the engagement that you're in, even against some of the scariest units of cavalry in the game, that can be the difference maker. Of course, armour piercing off the charge as well. The full charge bonus of 20. So again, we saw Cardolan's high-end lancers last time prioritise defence with a lower charge bonus but better defensive stats. Rhudaur Nobles, pretty much the blunt opposite. 1400 as well, so a little bit cheaper than other lance units, but the lower defence scores in the past, we have noticed that the Rhudaur Nobles do tend to melt away in comparison to their equivalents from other factions, just that little bit faster. So the defence score does matter. And of course they have the inspiration, which is less important for cavalry, and the fear, which is excellent for this kind of cavalry unit as well. And finally, a sign that their Numenorian heritage is on its last legs is the fact they don't have the Trebuchet of Numenor, but instead have the Barbarian Catapult, which, again, typical Catapult, it is going to have that splash damage that the Catapult is well known for. Very good in siege battles, a little bit clumsy and difficult to use on the open field, I would say, because unless you manage to position it perfectly almost right from the off, you have to move it, and then you are subject to the whims of Medieval 2's pathfinding. But if you use it in a siege, it can be very, very effective. Another thing as well is that enemy cavalry is often going to want to try and target down your artillery, but the barbarians here do wield these spears, which means that enemy cavalry units need to make sure that their charge is swift and true. Otherwise, in much the same way as the Rhudaur marksman earlier on, these two-handed spears are going to be able to give them the business. And there are quite a lot of them as well. 203 means that even if enemy archers target them down, which they can do because obviously the armour score is very low, there's quite a lot of them to kill off. Artillery is one of those things, especially now that it's not so easy for ballistas to just snipe out these slightly more damaging focused artillery pieces. The interplay between artillery is one of those things that we'll have to see develop over the course of a few more battle replays before we can really make a judgment on it, but I think catapults will fill much the same role that they always did. A little bit of a risk, because usually the kind of places you're going to utilise them in is frontline fights that are already joined, which will probably include your men, so you don't want to rout your own forces. But the reward is that you can potentially crush your enemy's morale and do a huge amount of damage to them as well, and those can be the tipping points in big battles. But yeah, indeed, the damage that they can dish out is impressive, both with their artillery and with their faction as a whole. If you do like this kind of... I mean, I've always found Rhudaur to be pretty damn effective, to be fair, ever since they've been added. I mean, I guess it's a tribute to the fact that throwing projectiles, based on how they are in the meta at the moment, both in the last patch and in this one, they're one of the things which has remained pretty much the same in terms of their effectiveness level. They are very, very good in terms of basing your army around and especially in siege battles. It's one of the things which keeps Rhudaur competitive in this regard as well, because without that, their lower defensive scores would be a real hobbling factor for them, I think. But yeah, in terms of mechanical effectiveness, you can't deny Rhudaur, and also in terms of just their identity in general, I've always found them to be a pretty interesting one. However, next time we will round out the 3 petty kingdoms of Arnor by talking about the ones which most closely resemble the kingdom from which they all spawned, and that is, of course, Arthedain. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for that.